Hello, everyone. I'm Zachary Campbell, and welcome to this series on photography. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, I'm Zach, a local photographer, and today I'm going to talk to you about the basics of photography. Specifically, talking about what's known as the exposure triangle, a series of three things that you can control on your camera that determines the exposure of your image, along with how that image looks. Before we begin, I want to talk about some general concepts regarding these units. First of all is exposure. Exposure is how much light is or is not coming into your frame. Now, exposure is based off of a concept called middle gray that comes to us from the origins of black and white photography. With black and white, you have black, you have white, and you have shades of gray in between, where blacks are your shadows, whites are your highlights, and gray would be in the middle. So the perfect average of light, more or less, in that frame. How exposure is measured from middle gray is called a stop of light, which is either a doubling or a halving of that light. So if you have one stop above middle gray, you have doubled the amount of light that is coming through the lens. Whereas if you have one stop below, you have halved the amount of light. Which brings us to the exposure triangle, which is composed of the three items that we're going to be talking about, which is ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now, how this works is that you can take one stop of light or add one stop of light to any of those three corners, and if you were to do the opposite on a different corner, it would still remain in balance. You would still have your middle gray. So the first corner of our triangle is what's known as ISO, or occasionally ASA. ISO stands for the International Standards Organization, which codified and unified the standard for sensitivity of film and is one that we still use today for the sensitivity of digital sensors and cameras. Now, how ISO is measured is based off of the stop system. If you wanted to increase your ISO by one stop, that would be a doubling of the number. So from 100, you would go to 200 if you were increasing one stop, or if you were decreasing one stop, you would go from ISO 100 to 50. With digital sensors, it's very easy to do. You just turn a dial. With film, you would have to swap out a different ISO film. Now, with each corner of the triangle, when you increase or decrease by a stop of light, there are other side effects that come with that. With ISO, you have possibly the simplest. When you increase the sensitivity, you get either more grain or more digital noise based off of if you're using film or a digital sensor. Whereas when you decrease by a stop of light, it's much cleaner. You have less noise, you have less grain, and so you have just a clear, crisper image. As you can see with these two images, there's a distinct difference in the amount of grain that is visible between them. One of these is at ISO 200, and the other one is at ISO 3200. So it's a 4-stop difference in the sensitivity of the film. And with that, you can see that there is a drastic increase. It's especially noticeable in the gray areas, especially around this lighthouse, where you can see the sky just becomes fuzzy almost. Not out of focus, just textured. So with this first activity, what we're going to do is I'm going to have you take some photos but change the ISO each time so you can have an understanding of the impact that it has on the image. But to get a better feel for it and to get a better feel with the specific camera that you're using, I want you to take photos of yourself and just observe the differences that occur. For the second corner of our triangle, we have what's known as shutter speed. It's very simple and exactly how it sounds. It is the speed of the shutter opening and closing. Now, shutter speed is measured very similarly to ISO in that it is based off of stops, and when you increase the amount of light that's coming in, increasing the stop, you double the speed. Whereas if you are decreasing, you're halving the speed. So, for example, if you have a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second and you want to increase the light, it goes to 1/25th of a second. Whereas if you were to decrease that, it would be 1/100th of a second. So with these two examples, you can see a clear distinction in terms of the shutter speed. Obviously, these are two somewhat extreme examples because the one on the left is only 1/100th of a second and the one on the right is over 4 seconds. But you can clearly see how it expresses traffic differently. How the left one, you can see all of those cars clearly, whereas the one that's over 4 seconds, you just have those streaks of light that are sort of typical of long exposures of traffic. So what I want you to do in this next activity is much like the first activity where we change the ISO for multiple pictures. I want you to change the shutter speed for those photos. Make sure your subject is something that is in motion and try a couple of things. Try not only staying still and seeing how they blur, but also try following them and see if you can get the world around them to sort of smear. Also, with these activities, you're not looking for perfection. Have fun with it. Do badly. Try your best just to experiment and get a feeling for how this affects your image and how certain shutter speeds affect that image. As much as you can make an equation for something or make a chart, it's much easier to just try things and then sort of get an innate sense for how this works. Finally, we come to the last corner of the triangle, aperture. All aperture is how big or how small the hole in the lens is. As opposed to the units for ISO or shutter speed, where there's a clear understanding of what is more or what is less, aperture's units, which are known as f-stops, are not in any way clear. So rather than explain, I'm just going to put a chart here. You can pause the video and look at it, and that will explain it. Do you understand that the numbers don't really make sense, and that's okay? Finally, with aperture, we have our trade-offs and what is known as depth of field. What depth of field means is how much of your image is in focus. How that works is the smaller your aperture, the more is going to be in focus, whereas the wider the aperture, the less is. If you've ever seen portraits that just have a really dreamy background, or even sometimes the person's face just falls out of focus, that's a shallow depth of field. Whereas if you've ever seen Citizen Kane, or have really ever taken a photo with your phone, and it feels like everything's in focus, that's a wider depth of field, and usually because the hole or the aperture is smaller. So for the examples, on the left, the image was taken wide open. The lens was at f1.8. On the right, I had it stopped down to f8 to get more things in focus. And you can really see the difference when we zoom in with these. Specifically, with the first image, you can see how even just the ground really goes from out of focus to in focus right around him. And then the background, it definitely like blurs quite a bit. With the other image, by comparison, you can really see how everything is pretty much in focus. Maybe not perfect, because f8 is not, the smallest you can go. But you do get a better sense of environment and the general landscape of things. As a result of that, With a shallower depth of field, you can really draw your attention to your focal point, to whatever it is that you want specifically to be in focus and to be the point of attention for that photo. When you have a deeper depth of field, you have to draw attention in other ways. So what I'm going to have you do with this final activity is I want you to, like the other two, take a series of photos with varying apertures. If you have a camera, you can set your camera to aperture priority mode, and it will adjust the other settings based off of what aperture you choose. I want you to try to focus on subjects that are closer and farther away, especially when you have that shallower depth of field, so you can get more of a sense of how having things out of focus works with the overall image. I hope these explanations and activities gave you a better understanding of the exposure triangle and how to properly expose an image. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.